simply for entertainment, I thought I would start with Jay Leno from March a year ago, which most of you probably didn't see. You see my sound screen. Yeah, here we go. This is just for fun.
Speaking of conservatives, the University of Colorado in Boulder is now adding to its faculty a professor of conservative thought and philosophy. You know, I had one of those when I was in college. He was called my dad. Get a haircut. Turn that crap down.
So, yeah, it's got a lot of attention if it makes Jay Leno's monologue. We'll come back to this in a couple of minutes. So I thought what we do for the last 3 weeks I'm here just to have fun is do some sort of informal, more casual evening events. And so naturally what I did was put together a 30-page lecture, which is ridiculous. It's way too long. I won't get through it all. I'm going to cut it down. Or I'll just stop after my voice runs out, and we'll spill over to next week. We don't have to stick rigidly to the way it's laid out. We can sort of do whatever we want. And I chose this rather remarkable and unexpected title for tonight to launch these things. What I call here, The Lost Art of Statesmanship, from Max Weber to Winston Churchill. And that's an unusual pairing. If you know anything about Max Weber, everybody knows a little bit about Winston Churchill, of course. But I want to try and make the connection, bold as it may be, because the two of them together, more so for Weber than people recognize, reopen a question that's hardly asked anymore, which is, what is a statesman? It's usually thought, especially by intellectuals and academics, that it's impossible to define the idea of a statesman rigorously, and therefore it's impossible to study systematically. And so we tend not to do it anymore in higher education or in political science departments. No, ordinary citizens, such as you can use that phrase, I tend not to like to, they still use the term a lot. We do, we should say we, ordinary citizen. And usually it's meant in ordinary speech as denoting someone who stands above the ordinary run of politicians in some way or another. You might say they're people of extraordinary accomplishment, people who make significant change, but to say that that's a statesman is not a very exacting definition. So let me give you 3 quotations, 2 very short and 1 quite a bit longer to set the scene. The first one's from Thomas Reed, who was the Speaker of the House 110 years ago or so. And he said, a statesman, I'm quoting here now, a statesman is a successful politician who is dead. That's a slightly more refined version of the thought that a statesman is a politician that we like. Second, a very colorful British politician from 34 years ago named Enoch Powell, very controversial figure. He said, all political lives end in failure. All political lives end in failure. Come back to that thought. There's a great deal of truth to that, even among the people we often call statesmen. I mean, Churchill's one of the best examples. He wins World War II, and then what do the British people do? They toss him out of office in a landslide. How's that for gratitude, right? And I think, however, what Powell is after is it may be speaking to the inherent limitations of either individual human beings or our institutions, or perhaps both. It's a very popular theme, been around for a long time, at least since Rousseau, if not earlier, that if we could just get our institutions right, everything would go better, right? The problem is our institutions. It reminds me of the poet Randall Jarrell, who once said, I think back in the 60s, if only we could get our hands on this fellow's society, we could sort everything out, right? Everyone's always blaming society for crime, poverty. It's society's fault. Whoever this person's society is, we should arrest him and lock him up. The third quotation, this is a bit longer, I hope to bear with me here. I'm going to have a lot of long quotations here tonight that are worth going through at length, I think. And this one is an excellent discussion of the idea of statesmanship from Lincoln in his eulogy to Henry Clay in 1852, a speech not often read in the canon of Lincoln speeches. And I'll just give you 3 paragraphs from it. The whole thing's worth reading, and you can find all these on the internet today, of course. The first 2 paragraphs would go as follows. And remember that Lincoln referred to Henry Clay as his beau ideal of a statesman. So Lincoln said Clay was his model. Had Clay lived to 1860, I have little doubt that Lincoln would have backed him for president. Clay, like Lincoln at that time, was a Whig. The Whig Party was falling apart. Who knows if Clay would have ended up in the new Republican Party or not? Hard to say. You can't know, of course. course. But I think it's quite likely that whatever party Clay affiliated with after the Whig Party fell apart, Lincoln would have been for him for president in 1860. He said this: "It is probably true he owed his preeminence to no one quality, but to a fortunate combination of several. He was surpassingly eloquent, but many eloquent men fail utterly, and they are not, as a class, generally successful. His judgment was excellent, but many men of good judgment live and die unnoticed. His will was indomitable, but this quality often secures to its owner nothing better than a character for useless obstinacy. These then were Mr. Clay's leading qualities. No one of them is very uncommon, but all taken together are rarely combined in a single individual. And this is probably the reason why such men as Henry Clay are so rare in the world." Second paragraph. "That his views and measures were always the wisest, needs not to be affirmed, nor should it be on this occasion, where so many, thinking differently, join in doing honor to his memory." I mean, the point here is obvious. We always tend to honor our presidents when they die, either through the other party of our own, right? That's a nice trait that Americans have, and I think most democratic countries have. "A free people in times of peace and quiet, when pressed by no common danger, naturally divide into parties. At such times, the man who is of neither party is not, cannot be, of any consequence." You can pause here and note that Lincoln is sort of swatting away this occasional popular idea that, we don't want someone from either party. Let's have Ross Perot until we figure out he's crazy. Right? Mr. Clay, therefore, was of a party. Taking a prominent part, as he did, in all the great political questions of his country for the last half-century, the wisdom of his course on many is doubted and denied by a large portion of his countrymen. And here Lincoln's pointing out the obvious, right? Our basic partisan divisions get in the way of considering the idea of statesmanship, objectively or with some amount of detachment, right? And that makes the study of it systematically a difficult thing to do. Finally, one more paragraph from Lincoln on Clay, and it's about Clay's oratory, the theme we'll want to return to at the very end of the lecture tonight, if I make it all the way to the end. Mr. Clay's eloquence did not consist, as many fine specimens of eloquence do, of types and figures, of antithesis and elegant arrangement of words and sentences, but rather of that deeply earnest and impassioned tone and manner which can proceed only from great sincerity and a thorough conviction in the speaker of the justice and importance of his cause. This it is that truly touches the chords of human sympathy, and those who heard Mr. Clay never failed to be moved by it, or ever afterwards forgot the impression. All his efforts were made for practical effect. He never spoke merely to be heard. Unlike, say, almost all members of the House of Representatives in the morning. Anyway, I'll throw out a couple of definitions here to work with as we go forward. One is that I incline to the old-fashioned view, stretching back to Aristotle, that the art of statesmanship is conducted through the old virtue of prudence. And of course, the problem these days is the first President Bush kind of debased the word. If you remember the old Saturday Night Live sketches from the late 80s and early 90s, wouldn't be prudent, right? And so it became something of a joke. Aristotle wrote at great length about this. It's subtle and difficult to grasp. I'm not going to try and go through it in a tedious way. I'll just say that the prudence of the statesman comes in two parts. One is an attachment to principle. That's the easy part. You hear whether on the left, on the, you say Occupy Wall Street, or on the right, on the Tea Party, somebody's principle, right? You're going to stick to their principles and go down with guns blazing. The second part is maybe the important part. It's a profound understanding of the circumstances at the moment. And that's why almost every person you call a great statesman, the common run of citizens do, can usually be found to be inconsistent or even contradictory. You can quote Churchill, Lincoln, Jefferson, Franklin Roosevelt. You can quote them on both sides of a lot of things. And is that just because they'll say anything because they're politicians, or is there something more to be figured out about that? Now, that's a vague starting point, but I don't think it's any less vague than the idea of, say, sustainable development, which is all the rage these days everywhere, right? And in one sentence, I think that the formal political education of students today is very incomplete. And how have we gotten to this pass? Well, I subscribe to what I call the Yogi Berra School of Epistemology, philosophers in the room. Yogi Berra, a great neglected political philosopher, used to say, you can observe a lot just by watching. And if you hang around Washington, D.C. for a while, as I did for 15 years, you start to notice something that ought to strike us as a bit odd. The President of the United States has his Council of Economic Advisors, and usually it's 3 people. It's usually 3 academic economists on leave from a university. And just about every government agency or cabinet level agency, independent agency, has a chief economist. Usually a PhD, sometimes on loan from a university, but almost always a PhD and all the advanced training from the economics departments. And you wouldn't think of being without a chief economist or several. The Federal Trade Commission, or name your favorite agency, or least favorite agency, it doesn't matter. On the other hand, the White House has no council of political advisors, nor does any executive branch agency have an academic political advisor. Now, they have political advisors, of course, but if you think about it for a minute, they're almost always practitioners. It's Karl Rove or David Axelrod, or people who are really good at winning elections. Sometimes those people do take in, or take on board for their campaign work, a lot of academic research from political science departments. They usually don't like to admit it because they like to perpetuate the view that they're just intrinsic geniuses, right? And that's why they get the big bucks, which they do. And occasionally, presidents will have an in-house intellectual. This goes back at least to the brains trust of Franklin Roosevelt, but John F. Kennedy had Arthur Schlesinger and a whole bunch of other folks. Lyndon Johnson had a guy named John P. Roach, who I think was from Brandeis. Richard Nixon, oddly enough, took Pat Moynihan into the White House to be his domestic policy advisor. Gerald Ford had a guy from the University of Chicago named Bob Goldwyn. Bill Clinton had Bill Galston. It goes on down the list. George W. Bush didn't, neither does President Obama, I think. But those figures are always idiosyncratic. The economists are kind of interchangeable. These political figures that they occasionally have aren't. They're always sort of without portfolio. They don't really have a specific job. Now, the mystery deepens when you think about this story. About 15 years back, E.J. Dionne, who was a liberal columnist for the Washington Post, but is something of an academic junkie. I mean, I still run into him at American Political Science Association conventions. He's one of the few journalists who attends, and he's back in the old days before the internet, he'd be in the paper room scooping up papers from panels. And the APSA meets about every 4 years in Washington, D.C., so you get 5,000 to 6,000 political scientists parked in Washington. And EJ got curious about how detached it seemed to be from what is the Super Bowl of politics in the world, right? And he went around with a catalog of all the panels to people on Capitol Hill and in the newsroom at the Washington Post and at the Brookings Institution where he's a fellow, and said, gosh, look, there's always political scientists having all these great panels. Do you see anything here that would be of interest and use to you? People would look through a few pages of it, shake their head and say, no, I see nothing here of use to me. It's the people who are writing our laws, right, and conducting our politics at the highest level, finding the biggest collection of academic political scientists to be of little relevance to their day-to-day lives, quite unlike economists. And it wasn't the first time, the last time this happened. Ezra Klein, when he was still at the Post in 2010, wrote this paragraph. There were no political luminaries in attendance at the American Political Science Association's convention last week. The fact that the country's brightest political scholars had all gathered at the Marriott Boardman Park barely seemed to register on the rest of the town. Worse, you got the feeling that the political scientists knew it. One of the conference's highlights, according to the website, was a panel titled, Is Political Science Relevant? Now, stop for a moment and ask, would the American Economics Association ever have a panel on Is Economics Relevant? I think probably not, although I would pay money to see a panel at the AEA on the topic, how come none of us foresaw the housing bubble and crash? Maybe they're overrated. The year before Klein, Joseph Nye at Harvard's Kennedy School is an eminent figure in the field. He wrote also in the Post, scholars are paying less attention to questions about how their work relates to the policy world. And in many departments, a focus on policy can hurt one's career. Advancement comes faster for those who develop mathematical models, new methodologies, or theories expressed in jargon that is unintelligible to policymakers. Close quote. Now, I want to be careful of discriminating and extending too broadly Nye's implicit criticism here of quantitative obsession, you might say, with the social sciences. It's often been overdone over the years. I'll pull up one quick example here. Yeah, this is one that's kind of fun. I'll put it this way. Although I think an awful lot of social science is, put it this way. I'll put it this way. I won't pick on academic departments like the one here, which I think is pretty good, or other universities. But the story out this week that the World Bank churns out lots of studies. Somebody went and looked at their site meter, I guess, and found that a third of them that they produced have never been downloaded a single time. Tells you where they can cut some budget right away, right? And I think that social science is best when it does one big thing. It'll often go into the data and demonstrate that it's some counterintuitive truth. In other words, they'll find out that something we all think is true turns out to be completely backwards just because our perceptions are off and it gathers momentum in the media. They're very good at doing that, and I think that's pretty useful. Oftentimes, they're proving the obvious, I think. So here's a paper right now that's getting a lot of attention by Martin Gillens at Princeton and Ben Page at Northwestern. They're very eminent in political science. And what they've done is spend a lot of time going through data, and I'll show you their conclusion here. I don't know if you can read that. Multivariate analysis, that's what you do, right? It says that big business groups or the wealthy elites dominate American politics. They tend to get their way in Washington. This is not exactly a man bites dog story, right? But then, the very next page, you see something you see in almost all social science articles, which is here. Our measures are far from perfect. And by the way, one of the, I think, errors of this paper is it talks about there's business lobbies and there's labor lobbies, but they don't distinguish the fact that a lot of business lobbies are often in opposition to each other. In other words, not all big business has the same interest. But, I mean, they're right in some larger points. The chief defender of the carried interest tax treatment for hedge fund managers is not conservative Republicans. It's Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, is their buddies, right, and it's financiers. So, but we see here that we need further research. Almost all social science article ends by saying we need further research. But this paper, it did something really quite amazing. It's not going to be formally published until the fall in Perspectives on Politics. But they decided to put a press release for the paper, and lo and behold, Gillens and Page got on the Daily Show. That's a pretty big deal for academics, right? It was terrific. But then Jon Stewart asked them, so what's the remedy for this problem? And they both sort of said, we don't really know. I mean, we kind of like campaign finance reform or two or three other things, but they're just sort of their opinions. They don't have another sort of layer of studies to show how that might work. This is where I wanted the blackboard, but I don't have one here tonight, so I'm just going to use a piece of paper if I can. If you open up the American Political Science Review, almost at random, most of the time you will find an article that's heavily mathematical, and will have a big, long equation. And I actually do need to write one down so you can see it, because there we go, it'll go like that. So one that I picked out at random recently was a model for the behavior of labor unions in Argentinian elections. And, well, you remember that one? Someone said. Yes, good breakfast reading, right? And I want to write down the basic equation. It won't actually be necessary to really read this. So this one, I would write this on the blackboard. But, so you start out with u equals 1 divided by 2 times b1 minus x1 plus b1. And now, if you've ever seen, let me put it this way, what's the most famous scientific equation ever? You all know this, of course. There's never any puzzle about that, right? Anybody ever seen that derived and how it works? Yeah, you've been through you would take all the blackboards around this room and do it. If you've ever seen it, it's Einstein's aha moment was a long chain of derivation from much longer equations, making them smaller. Then you get to E equals mc squared, and that, oversimplified, is why atom bombs go boom. Pretty real equation. Now, social science equations, you can use Milton Friedman's mv equals pq for monetarism, or this one. Almost always, this is the beginning of the equation, it gets bigger as you use it. Exactly the opposite of a physics equation. And while it may be useful and have some predictive ability to know how labor unions are likely to behave in an election in Argentina, although it doesn't seem to get too close to Argentina's fundamental problems, I wonder if someday somebody's going to sit around on the blackboard looking for an aha moment, and they're going to look at all this and they're going to say, now let's do that. Let's take the square root of that, plus 5, and that equals, oh look, peace in the Middle East. It's probably not how we're going to solve the really difficult problems that vex us, right? That is why I like to draw back to Max Weber 100 years ago, in part because he is, if you know anything about him, he was one of the fathers of modern social science. He's one of the fathers of this very methodology that now dominates the social sciences. He didn't write directly about statesmanship as I'm talking about it, but he could not escape being almost literally haunted to the point of depression by the ethical dimensions of politics and human life itself. So very late in life, he wrote 2 fascinating essays. One was called Science as a Vocation. And it's in that essay, he quotes, of all people, Leo Tolstoy, saying that science can't answer the question, what should we do and how should we live? And then he gave a companion lecture around the same time, the fall of 1918, called Politics as a Vocation. And it's there he presented a very famous formulation of what he called the ethic of responsibility and the ethic of ultimate ends. This is really a more sophisticated version of the problem of ends and means. Now, when I go through this essay with students, which I often do at great length, I'll sometimes spend 2 or 3 class periods going through it carefully. It's 22,000 words long. It's quite a long lecture. I will often introduce it with a scene from Yes, Prime Minister, this is actually Yes, Minister, the first series, back in the 80s. Any of you ever watched this when this was on? Right, it was on in the 80s. It was actually written by a couple of graduate student dropouts from London School of Economics, so they really understood politics and economics. And it's popular these days to do college classes on The Wire and other popular culture. I could do a whole course on Yes, Minister and its sequel, Yes, Prime Minister. And the main theme of the whole show was, the fellow you'll see here is the Minister for Administrative Affairs. There's a low-level cabinet member. His name is Jim Hacker, and that's not a mistake. They want to portray him as something of a hack, see? And the storyline almost every time is how he's manipulated by the permanent bureaucrats. And guess who always wins? The bureaucracy always wins. So it's a wonderful case study in the way bureaucracies work. And the 2 people you'll see in the scene in a moment are the permanent private secretary. Understand that various civil servants, all the different cabinet departments have a permanent civil servant staff. And the principal private secretary is a big deal. And then the other person is sort of a lower level secretary to the minister. So I'm going to show about 8 minutes of this scene. Partly because it's fun, but also because it actually sets up getting into this question of bureaucracy and the nature of political leadership in the modern world in a way that might not be recognized. Let me make it a little bit bigger. Okay. You'll pick it up right away.
Well, it's not just that it shouldn't, but it couldn't. If it could, it wouldn't. Would it?
You are related to Sir Humphrey.
Humphrey, I must talk to you about something. Something that concerns me deeply. Really, profoundly important.
Is it the amendment to the administrative order on stock control and government establishments? Or the procedure for the renewal of local authority leaseholds in special development areas?
No, what concerns me is a great issue, really of life and death.
Oh, shouldn't that wait till after work?
It is work.
Oh, really? Well, please go on.
How do British armaments manufacturers sell their arms to foreigners?
Well, I believe you have to get an export license from the Department of Trade.
So private firms can sell their arms abroad?
Private companies and government agencies.
To whom do they sell?
Well, foreign governments, usually.
Is that all?
Well, sometimes you can sell to an arms dealer, third party. Perhaps a little man in Manchester buys on behalf of a party in the Channel Islands who has a contact in Luxembourg.
So there's no real control over who the arms go to in the end?
Oh, indeed there is. The dealer has to provide an end-user certificate, which is a signature acceptable to Her Majesty's government, that the ultimate customer is in fact an approved user.
Is that a real guarantee? I mean, would you be surprised, for instance, if a British aircraft carrier turned up in the Central African Republic?
Well, I, for one, Minister, would be very surprised. It's 1,000 miles inland.
Yes, you know what I mean. What about smaller weapons?
Well, it's virtually impossible. There's stringent security, rigorous inspection procedures, meticulous scrutiny.
You mean it's all a facade?
I think perhaps this conversation should end here, don't you, Minister?
No. It's as I thought. Last night, a confidential source disclosed to me that British arms are being sold to Italian Red terrorist groups.
I see. May I ask who this confidential source was?
I'm glad you said it was confidential.
Oh, I'm sorry, I naturally assumed that meant you were going to tell me.
You seem to be very worried by this information.
Well, these things happen all the time. It's not our problem.
So does robbery with violence. Doesn't that worry you?
No, Minister. Home Office problem.
Humphrey, we're letting terrorists get hold of murderous weapons.
We're not.
Well, who is?
Well, who knows? Department of Trade, Ministry of Defence, Foreign Office.
We, Humphrey, the British government. Innocent lives are being set at risk by British arms in the hands of terrorists.
Only Italian lives, not British lives.
The British tourists abroad.
Tourists? Foreign Office problem.
Humphrey, we have to do something.
With respect, Minister, we have to do nothing.
What do you mean?
The sale of arms abroad is one of those areas of government that we do not examine too closely.
Well, I have to, now that I know about
But
it.
you can say you don't know.
You're suggesting I should lie?
Oh, not you, Minister. No.
Well, who should lie?
Sleeping dogs, Minister.
I'm going to raise this.
No, Minister, I beg you. A basic rule of government is never look into anything you don't have to. And never set up an inquiry unless you know in advance what its findings will be.
Please, we're talking about good and evil.
Our Church of England problem.
No, our problem. We are discussing right and wrong.
You may be, Minister, but I'm not. It would be a serious misuse of government time.
Selling arms to terrorists is wrong. Can't you see that, Humphrey?
No, Minister. Either you sell arms or you don't. If you sell them, they will inevitably end up with people who have the cash to buy them.
But not terrorists.
Well, I suppose we could put some sort of government health warning on the rifle, perhaps. This gun can seriously damage your health.
Oh, we're about to take this lightly, Humphrey. But we cannot close our eyes to something that is as morally wrong as this.
Very well, Minister. If you insist on making me discuss moral issues, may I point out to you that something is either morally wrong or it isn't. It can't be slightly morally wrong.
No, don't quibble, Humphrey.
Government isn't about morality.
Really? What is it about then?
Stability. Keeping things going. Preventing anarchy. Stopping society. Falling to bits. Still being here tomorrow.
What for? What is the ultimate purpose of government, if it isn't for doing good?
Minister, government isn't about good and evil. It's only about order or chaos.
And it's in order for Italian terrorists to get British bombs. And you don't care.
It's not my job to care. That's what politicians are for. My job is to carry out government policy.
Even if you think it's wrong?
Well, almost all government policy is wrong, but frightfully well carried out.
Humphrey, have you ever known a civil servant to resign on a matter of principle?
I should think not. What an appalling suggestion.
The first time I fully understand that you are purely committed to means and not to ends.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, Minister, and all of my colleagues, there is no difference between means and ends.
If you believe that, Humphrey, you will go to hell.
Minister, I had no idea you had a theological bent.
You are a moral vacuum.
If you say so, Minister.
It's time for your lunch appointment, Minister.
You're keeping very quiet, Bernard. What would you do about all this?
I would keep very quiet, Minister.
So, Minister, may we drop this matter of the arms sales?
No, we may not. I'm going to tell the Prime Minister, personally. Make an appointment for me, would you, Bernard? This is just the sort of thing that the Prime Minister wants to know about.
I assure you, Minister, this is just the sort of thing the Prime Minister desperately wants not to know about.
We shall see about that.
Indeed, we will. What's the matter, Bernard?
Oh, nothing really, Sir Humphrey.
You look unhappy.
Well, I was just wondering if the Minister was right, actually.
Very unlikely. What about?
About ends and means. I mean, will I end up as a moral vacuum, too?
Oh, I hope so, Bernard. If you work hard enough.
Makes me feel rather downcast. If it's our job to carry out government policies, shouldn't we believe in them?
What an extraordinary idea.
Why?
Bernard, I have served 11 governments in the past 30 years. If I believed in all their policies, I would have been passionately committed to keeping out of the common market and passionately committed to going into it. I would have been utterly convinced of the rightness of nationalizing steel and of denationalizing it and renationalizing it. In capital punishment, I'd have been a fervent retentionist and an ardent abolitionist. I would have been a Keynesian and a Friedmanite, a grammar school preserver and destroyer, a nationalization freak and a privatization maniac, but above all, I would have been a stark-staring, raving schizophrenic.
So what do we believe in?
At this moment, Bernard, we believe in stopping the minister from informing the Prime Minister.
But why?
Because once the Prime Minister knows, there will have to be an inquiry, like Watergate. The investigation of a trivial break-in led to one ghastly revelation after another, and finally the downfall of a president. The golden rule is, don't lift lids off cans of worms.
No, Sir Humphrey.
Everything is connected to everything else. Who said that?
The Cabinet Secretary?
Nearly right. Actually, it was Lenin.
So how do you stop a Cabinet Minister talking to a Prime Minister?
Well, now, that is a very interesting question, you tell me.
I don't know.
Well, work it out, Bernard. You're supposed to be a high flyer. Or are you really a low flyer, supported by occasional gusts of wind?
Well, you can't stop the Minister seeing the PM, can you?
I can't, no.
Nor can the private office at number 10.
Correct.
So it has to be someone pretty high up in government.
Getting warmer.
Someone close to the PM, someone who can frighten the Minister. The Chief Whip?
Oh, excellent, Bernard. You've learnt a lot. So, how do you crack the whip?
I'm sorry?
How do you mobilize the Chief Whip?
Well, the Minister's asked me to phone the PM's private office for an appointment, so if you had a word with the Cabinet Secretary, and he had a word with the Diary Secretary, and they all had a word with the Whip's office, then when the Minister arrived, the Chief Whip could meet him and say the PM was rather busy, and had asked him to have a word with the Minister instead.
Excellent, Bernard. You should have taken a degree in engineering. What are you doing?
I thought you wanted to talk to the Cabinet Secretary.
I do indeed. Now, do you, Bernard, as the Minister's private secretary, feel obliged to tell the Minister of this conversation?
What conversation?
Well done, Bernard. You'll be a moral vacuum yet.
So, I do it partly for fun, but partly because it's sparkingly good writing, and partly because, especially some of the really serious parts of Max Weber's fun, that there's another way of treating this question of ends and means and instrumentality. I mean, Sir Humphrey Appleby here clearly represents what Weber would describe as the ethic of responsibility. We'll get into that further in a moment. And the Minister of Administrative Affairs, Mr. Hacker, clearly represents the ethic of ultimate ends. Moral standards have to be upheld regardless of consequences, or regardless of other considerations, you might say. I'm surprised, by the way, that we typically copy all these British shows. We made a version of House of Cards, but never copied this. There's been talk of it over the years, and I think it would be perfect. translate very well. But back to Weber, he was the most prominent and influential intellectual in Germany at the time for several decades. Most people know him best for his most famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He died in 1920, probably as one of the last victims of the Spanish influenza that swept the globe after World War I. I've always admired him for, among other things, his intellectual honesty. He was a man of the left, a critic of capitalism who talked a lot in the Marxist accents of class struggle. On the other hand, and he sympathized with socialism. On the other hand, he understood very clearly why socialism would never work. He said it wouldn't lead to liberation of the workers. His critique anticipates Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek in a lot of ways as to why it wouldn't work. But above all, he said that in a socialized economy, it wouldn't be the workers who'd be in charge, the way the romantic Marxists portrayed it. It will be just another class of bureaucrats. In fact, the phrase he used was, socialism would result in inescapable universal bureaucratization. And what should be added here is that he was not only one of the fathers of what we nowadays call value-free social science, not quite right, but pretty close to being right. He was also a theorist of bureaucracy. Even though you can see that I'll show you some work criticisms of bureaucracy he had. He said, look, the modern industrialized democratic world, whether it's socialist, capitalist, or something in between, in this respect he anticipates Schumpeter in a lot of ways, if you're familiar with Schumpeter's themes on what will happen to a capitalist economy. He said that eventually we're going to have bureaucratic rule, because there's no other way you're going to be able to organize large-scale private enterprise and public administration. Why bureaucracy? It was the only rational means of asserting power in a non-arbitrary and non-corrupt way. And he did a lot of writing about, especially about corruption in the United States. He visited the United States in the 1880s. And that was at the time we were going through our first round of civil service reform. We were finally getting disgusted with the spoil system, where whichever party won, the White House would then hire everybody all the way down to the post, local postal carriers, and it was a payoff to your political supporters. It was a way of spreading money around. It was often inefficient, and you can't have a system like this. And that's why we did our first round of civil service reform. Where's this quote from him here? He talked to some workers in Chicago. Yeah, he said, why do you put up with the corruption in this country? Here's how I describe it. Scarcely 15 years ago, when American workers were asked by him, but he's describing it in the third person here, when American workers were asked why they allowed themselves to be governed by politicians whom they admitted they despised, their answer was, quote, we prefer having people in office whom we can spit upon, rather than a caste of officials who spit upon us, as is the case with you. This was during Bismarck and the spreading bureaucracy and administration in Europe, and this was the American instinct at the time. So we don't want a class of political officials who spit on. We like being able to spit on them. And the workers he was talking to went on to say, and there's lots of money to go around. Weber concluded the following: describing the United States, a corruption and wastefulness second to none could be tolerated only by a country with as yet unlimited economic opportunities. But while Weber appreciated that bureaucracy would allow you to use specialized knowledge, expert knowledge, which would lead to predictable administration and the regularization of administration, he did, and all this anticipates some of the views of people like Woodrow Wilson, for example. He did understand that this would be gravely defective in some other ways that he didn't see a way out of. Some of his writing is really quite bold. I'm paraphrasing him here. The bureaucrats and bureaucracies would become single-minded, if not bloody-minded, in the pursuit of their mission, and they would tend to have narrower horizons. We saw Sir Humphrey Appleby here. His horizon's very narrow, just making sure the department runs efficiently. Things get on tomorrow. I'm not going to worry about moral considerations. And one of the phrases Weber used about bureaucracy was, everywhere the steel housing for the new bondage stands ready. We're fashioning our new cages for ourselves. We've escaped feudalism, and now he thinks we may be returning to something like it. in a different and more prosperous form, of course. And of bureaucrats, he said their rigid rule-bound procedures would isolate them from the people being governed and make them indifferent, he said, to the entrepreneurial spirit. He said entrepreneurs would eventually become dominated by the bureaucrats. This is a very familiar thing today, right? Complain about bureaucracy stifling entrepreneurial innovation in this country. Here's Max Weber saying this 100 years ago. But he used phrases like this. He said, bureaucrats will become specialists without spirit or vision and voluptuaries without heart. Who talks like that anymore, by the way? It's really vivid language that today's social scientists don't, I think, to their own detriment. So, politics as a vocation. He gives this lecture in the fall of 1918. I don't remember if it's before or after the armistice. It doesn't actually quite matter, but just think about the scene. Germany's falling apart, right? The monarchy's toppled. There's rumors and attempts at revolution almost on a daily basis. There's great disillusionment and bitter recriminations starting to fly around, right? That, of course, later feeds into the rise of Hitler, right? Many of Weber's own former students had become revolutionaries, and he actually has some specific individuals in mind late in this lecture. And his students, he was then teaching at the University of Munich, asked him to give a lecture. And at first he didn't want to. They wanted to give him a big, sprawling lecture, essentially asking, how should we think about this? What should we do? He didn't want to do it at first, and then the word came back, well, we're going to invite some other person who was I forget who it was now, but it was a sort of a rival of Weber's. Weber said, okay, I'll do this lecture. And as he puts it in the lecture, he's trying to answer the fundamental question, what sort of human being must one be to put one's hand on the wheel of history? As I said, it's 22,000 words. I'm only going to give you a little of it, but I do want to share the first paragraph and then the last paragraph, which is quite famous. But the first paragraph, I think, is interesting. He starts this way. This lecture, which I give at your request, will necessarily disappoint you in a number of ways. You will naturally expect me to take a position on actual problems of the day, but that will be the case only in a purely formal way and toward the end, when I shall raise certain questions concerning the significance of political action in the whole way of life. In today's lecture, all questions that refer to what policy and what content one should give to one's political activity must be eliminated. For such questions have nothing to do with the general question of what politics as a vocation means and what it can mean. He's saying, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not going to be here as an advocate. I don't have the answers. 2/3 of this essay are very dense and difficult and pedantic. He goes through different types of administration. He ranges over to China. He talks about Germany. He talks about Britain. He talks about the United States. He talks about France. He goes through his typology of different kinds of rule, traditional, legal, and charismatic. This is all another one of the interesting paradoxes of Max Weber is, while he was a theorist of bureaucracy, he's also the guy who brought us in political thought the idea of charisma in politics, which is now so familiar to us with people like John F. Kennedy, right? And, by the way, Weber was himself irreligious, as he put it, but he used in both of these lectures, science as a vocation and politics as a vocation. He uses the term vocation in the religious sense of a calling. And he understands charisma in exactly the way it's understood in the New Testament, as someone touched with the grace of God. Not just the way we think of charisma now with, George Clooney, you're handsome and popular. It means something the old-fashioned way the word charisma is understood, which I think is interesting. So the first 2/3 I usually have students skip because it's just hard to get through and you fall asleep. And then the last third of the essay, and he referred to the first paragraph saying towards the end, I'm really going to get down and dirty, is kind of what he said there. The last third takes a very dramatic turn. It's really astonishing to read. And when it goes right with students, they find it quite moving, I think. And here's his last paragraph, which is sometimes gets quoted, maybe one of the most famous things he ever wrote. Politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. Certainly all historical experience confirms the truth that man would not have attained the possible unless time and again he had reached out for the impossible. But to do that, a man must be a leader, and not only a leader, but a hero as well, in a very sober sense of the word. And even those who are neither leaders nor heroes must arm themselves with that steadfastness of heart which can brave even the crumbling of all hopes. This is necessary right now, or else men will not be able to attain even that which is possible today. Only he has the calling for politics, who is sure that he shall not crumble when the world, from his point of view, is too stupid or too base for what he wants to offer. Only he who in the face of all this can say, in spite of it all, has the calling for politics. In other words, I think it's hard to summarize that up, but again, who uses language like that today? He's saying political leaders, even heroes, he says. That's like a statesman. That's not a term that we can reduce in a rigorous, systematic, objective way, right? They're not only necessary, but in the real world it will involve heartbreak, frequent disappointment, and often tragedy. One thing that was vivid to Weber was the tragic sense of life, both large and small. And I think that will turn out to be true for most great statesmen you study. It's obviously true of Lincoln. I think also of Churchill, whose the last volume was World War II memoirs, remember, it was called Triumph and Tragedy, right? Now, there's a lot here. Oh, good grief, we're ripping through time here. What parts of this should I share here? You know, Aristotle said somewhere that politics is an activity unsuited to the young. Why would he say that, right? It's, well, you know, it's, I mean, partly maybe it's just as simple as the old idea that experience and age of maturity is what's necessary, right? And so a large part of the last third of his essay can be Max Weber trying to tell impressionistic but very motivated students that it's much harder than they think, maneuvering in political life, that the dilemmas are much more serious and not solvable. So a few samples here. Just pick up in the middle. Now then, what relations do ethics and politics actually have? Have the two nothing whatever to do with one another, as has occasionally been said? It was said, of course, you know, that's the commonplace rendering of Machiavelli, which is entirely wrong, and that's, of course, what Sir Humphrey Appleby was just saying a minute ago. Ethics and politics don't have anything to do with one another. Or is the reverse true, that the ethic of political conduct is identical with that of any other conduct? And he goes on here to say, is there a reason for supposing that the ethical rules that we think bind us in our relations with other human beings, with the shopkeeper, is the political world different? And he says, yes, it is different. Why? The famous formula of Max Weber is that politics is a special means. It's power backed up by violence. Right? The political world ultimately depends upon force. And that's what changes things. Now, he says a lot more about how you can't simply let passions run away with you. And then he talks finally about the Sermon on the Mount. Let's see if I can pick up that in the middle. And he quotes the Sermon on the Mount. All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. And fighting is everywhere fighting. Hence the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount. By the Sermon on the Mount, we mean the absolute ethic of the gospel, which is a more serious matter than those who are fond of quoting these commandments today believe. This ethic is no joking matter. The same holds for this ethic as has been said of causality and science. It is not a cab which one can have stopped at one's pleasure. It is all or nothing. And then he goes on to shift focus entirely to the radicals, the revolutionaries. You tell the revolutionary, look, if it's the old Leninist view of the worse the better, right? Things we just stick purely to our principles, things fall apart, that will be good for us. And that, you see, would be irresponsible to favor things. Except he says it's very hard to judge these matters. Yeah, let's pick up here in the middle. The ethic of ultimate ends apparently must go to pieces on the problem of the justification of means by ends. If one makes any concessions at all to the principle that the end justifies the means, it is not possible to bring an ethic of ultimate ends and an ethic of responsibility under one roof, or to decree ethically which end should justify which means. The early Christians knew full well the world is governed by demons, and that he who lets himself in for politics, that is, for power and force as means, contracts with diabolical powers, and for his action it is not true that good can follow only from good, and evil only from evil, but that often the opposite is true. Anyone who fails to see this is indeed a political infant. Whoever wants to engage in politics at all, and especially in politics as a vocation, meaning if you're really going to be engaged deeply in political, making decisions, writing laws, carrying out actions. Whoever wants to engage in politics at all, and especially in politics as a vocation, has to realize these ethical paradoxes. He must know that he is responsible for what may become of himself under the impact of these paradoxes. I repeat, he lets himself in for the diabolic forces lurking in all violence. He goes on and talks about how, I kind of feel this way sometimes, 9 out of 10 politicians and would-be politicians, he says, he uses this phrase, he thinks are windbags. Technical term of social science, I suppose. And he says they intoxicate themselves with romantic sensations. And this is close to the end. However, it is immensely moving when a mature man, no matter whether old or young in years, see here he does say it's possible to be mature about politics while you're young. And you can think about students in 1918, seeing what's going on around them, they'd be growing up and getting mature in a hurry, right? It is immensely moving when a mature man, no matter whether old or young in years, is aware of a responsibility for the consequences of his conduct and really feels such responsibility with heart and soul. He then acts by following an ethic of responsibility, and somewhere he reaches the point where he says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That, of course, is quoting Martin Luther, beginning of the Reformation. That is something genuinely human and moving. And every one of us who is not spiritually dead must realize the possibility of finding himself at some time in that position. Insofar as this is true, an ethic of ultimate ends and an ethic of responsibility are not absolute contrasts, but rather supplements, which only in unison constitute a genuine man, a man who can have the calling for politics. In other words, if I could be so bold as to say, summarize this very complicated and rich argument in one sentence, he's actually telling students they have to get their souls in order. As I say, social scientists today don't talk that way, don't think that way, right? And I think, more broadly speaking, and I've just given you a few little samples, I think Weber has come close to describing the character and temperament of anyone who would aspire to be a statesman. Now, where are we here? Oh, it's almost 7:30. I'll never get through all this. So I'll just go on a little bit longer and stop and do questions, and we'll take up again next week with a whole lot more. And I think the person who appreciated all the difficulties of modern politics best, and whose perception of the matter tracks Weber's most closely, is Churchill, which doesn't really occur to many people, and it occurs to me for a passage that I actually forgot to bring with me, which is one reason why I want to put off till next week. I don't think I did. I forgot it. Yeah, I did. Darn it. The central question of Churchill's whole life was whether statesmanship was possible in modern mass democracy. He even reached some of the same conclusions as Max Weber, about whether or not bureaucratic rule would be necessary. He came about it in different ways, and his language was different. But the same thing was on his mind. And he started reflecting on this problem at a very early age, when he was still in his 20s. People ask me what Churchill book they should read or which ones they should read, because he wrote, 50 books, 5 million words in his career. And I always say, start with his autobiography, My Early Life, which takes his life up to age 30. One of the things he says in there that's fun is, a man must either nail his life to the cross of thought or the cross of action. And yet that's a noble lie in his case, as Socrates would have put it, because no person was both more thoughtful and involved in more action over 5 decades than he was. I like to point out to students who don't really know anything about Churchill, because it's not really taught much, don't assign biographies like we ought to, that Churchill participated in the last cavalry charge in the British Army in 1898 in the Battle of Omdurman. 55 years later, when he's prime minister for the second time, he's sitting down with President Eisenhower to try and figure out what to do about nuclear weapons. So from cavalry charges to nuclear weapons in the span of one man's active lifetime. So in My Early Life, he writes this in about the middle. He writes this when he's just 40 years old, I guess. The character of society, the foundations of politics, the methods of war, the outlook of youth, the scale of values are all changed, and changed to an extent I should not have believed possible in so short a time without any violent domestic revolution. I wonder often whether any other generation has seen such astounding revolutions of data and values as those through which we have lived. Scarcely anything material or established which I was brought up to believe was permanent and vital has lasted. Everything I was sure or taught to be sure was impossible has happened. One of the things everybody thought was impossible up to about almost exactly 100 years now was Europe would never go to war again. You can't have a big war again like you had in the 1870s. Famous book by Norman Angell, Angell was his name, published around 1912, called The Grand Illusion, or maybe it was The Great Illusion, I forget the exact title. And the argument was, Europe can't go to war because they can't afford it. It'd be too expensive now, these big armies. The countries will bankrupt themselves. Well, they went to war anyway and bankrupted themselves. It didn't matter. I don't know how many people know this because it was never in the paper, but Britain did not finish fully paying off its war debts from World War I to the United States until about 6 years ago. The Marxists, of course, thought, if war breaks out in Europe, the working classes will rise up and it will get a revolution. And that's not what happened at all. Working classes signed up in droves to go fight against the other country, which is what made Lenin improvise in a hurry. Right? Churchill was the one person who thought it was possible. While everyone else was being optimistic it couldn't happen, as early as 1900, 1901, he's worried about how this might happen. And the main reason he thought about it was from that cavalry charge in 1898 in the Sudan. He wrote originally, this is kind of funny, he wrote originally a 2-volume book about that war called The River War. He printed about 800 copies, but he had been harshly critical of the British military at age 25. Maybe not so prudent for someone who wants to go into politics, especially General Kitchener, Lord Kitchener, the commanding general. And he's about to run for Parliament for the first time, which he loses, and he decides that he wants to suppress the book and edit it down to take out all these politically unhelpful comments that he rashly made. So the original edition disappeared over 100 years ago. I managed to get a photocopy of it once. If you can find the book, it's very rare. It sells for thousands of dollars. It is finally going to be republished. The Churchill family gave their permission a few years ago. A friend of mine has annotated it, Jim Muller at the University of Alaska. The original edition has some passages that were not in the abridged editions you can find that were later released. And one of them described the final battle in which you had about 12,000 British infantry up in a line on a hill and about something like 40,000 of the Arab soldiers, the dervishes of the Sudan, charged out. The closest any one of them got was about 150 yards to the British line. Here's his description of it. More than 12,000 British infantry were engaged in that mechanical scattering of death, which the polite nations of the earth had brought to such monstrous perfection. One of the knocks on Churchill was that he was a warmonger, right? He delighted in war. When you read more of him, you start to come to a different judgment. They fired steadily and stolidly, without hurry or excitement, for the enemy were far away and the officers careful. Besides, the soldiers were interested in the work and took great pains. But presently the mere physical act became tedious. He's describing what sounds like a factory assembly line. In this case, it's a factory assembly line of death, right? The tiny figures seen over the slide of the back sight seemed a little larger, but also fewer at each successive volley. The rifles grew hot, so hot that they had to be changed. For those of the reserve companies. The Maxim guns exhausted all the water in their jackets, and several had to be refreshed from the water bottles of the Cameron Highlanders before they could go on with their deadly work. The empty cartridge cases, tinkling to the ground, formed small but growing heaps beside each man. And all the time out on the plain, on the other side, bullets were shearing through flesh, smashing and splintering bone. Blood spouted from terrible wounds. Valiant men were struggling on through a hell of whistling metal, exploding shells and spurting dust, suffering, despairing, dying. Such was the first phase of the Battle of Omdurman. The Khalifa's plan of attack appears to have been complex and ingenious. It was, however, based on an extraordinary miscalculation of the power of modern weapons. With the exception of this cardinal error, it was not necessary to criticize it. Now, so Churchill the warmonger, the other cliche about him is that he was a racist and imperialist. Of course, is there any other kind these days, right? The British guy. If this were true, the River War the book would read very differently than it does. It would just be a Manichaean tale of the complete triumph of the superior forces of good over the forces of evil and depravity. There's the famous lyric from the Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc at the time that went, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." And that sort of encapsulated the idea that the technological superiority of European nations implied some kind of moral superiority. But that's not the tone you get from Churchill's writing about the other side, so to speak. He does have some very bracing and controversial criticisms of Islam, which have lately been revived over in Britain. That's another story for another day. But throughout his several chapters on the 3 or 4 days of fighting around Omdurman, it's remarkable how much he considers the courage and virtue and humanity of the enemy that they're slaughtering. And, as I say, there's lots of criticism of the British military for behaving badly when they finally sacked the Khartoum. And so here's one of the more interesting passages in the original edition that I'm sorry that he cut out and was lost for a very long time. Speaking of the Arabs, he says this: "Yet these were as brave men as ever walked the earth. The conviction was borne in on me that their claim beyond the grave in respect of a valiant death was not less good than that which any of our countrymen could make. The valor of their deed has been discounted by those who have told the tale. Mad fanaticism is the depreciating comment of their conquerors. I hold this to be a cruel injustice. Nor can he be a very brave man who will not credit them with a nobler motive and believe that they died to clear their honor from the stain of defeat. Why should we regard as madness in a savage what would be sublime in civilized men?" Okay. Then this paragraph appears. He's 26 years old, 25 years old when he's writing this. And who does this think this sounds like? From later on. "For I hope that if evil days should come upon our own country, and the last army which a collapsing empire could interpose between London and the invader were dissolving in rout and ruin, that there would be some, even in these modern days, who would not care to accustom themselves to a new order of things and tamely survive the disaster." How did Churchill know that that would be him in 40 years? Churchill did have a speech, by the way, prepared in case the German invasion started. And the provisional title of it was, "You Can Take One With You." He said, housewives can get out a big kitchen knife and wait in ambush in their houses for when the first German soldier came in. And he was going to stay. But even though he had that character about him, which is sort of obvious later on, right? He did say that you're seeing the mechanization of death. And so here's how he put it. In one of his first speeches in Parliament in 1901, one of his first term in the House of Commons, he talked about, in the former days, wars were mostly about the ambitions of kings, fought by professional, semi-private armies, right? They were fought by small, regular armies of professional soldiers. And he said that smaller scale of warfare made it possible to limit the liabilities of the combatants. This is 1901, remember, 13 years before World War I starts. But now, when mighty populations are impelled against each other, each individual severally embittered and inflamed, when the resources of science and civilization sweep away everything that might mitigate their fury, a European war can only end in the ruin of the vanquished and the scarcely less fatal commercial dislocation and exhaustion of the conquerors. Democracy, he said, is more vindictive than cabinets. The wars of people will be more terrible than those of kings. They say he's 26 years old when he's giving that speech in the House. So there's a lot more to that story, and I think I don't want to drone on for another 20 minutes. I've talked for an hour and I'm going to run out of gas, but there's a lot more to say, including some really direct intersections between Churchill in the 30s as he's trying to figure out what ought to be said and done against the rise of Germany that traces right back to what Max Weber was, even some of the language. I don't think Churchill ever read Weber. He was too busy by the time that lecture was translated into English. We do know that Churchill read Machiavelli quite carefully. He used to send copies of the books to lots of his friends and read lots of the other great books on his own when he was a young lieutenant in India. But the broader point is, and I'll just sort of stop here and we have some fun or whatever, is he understood that the problem of warfare in the 20th century and beyond could be not just ruin civilization, but it would undermine liberal democracy. It would be the ruination of democratic self-governance. He had a similar view about domestic policy. I mean, Churchill's known overwhelmingly for his foreign outlook. But in the first decade in the Liberal Party in the House of Commons, he was one of the architects of, he's the guy who actually came up with the phrase we use in modern times, the safety net. And what he said was, I think it was workers' compensation, he was for early forms of health insurance, unemployment insurance, mine safety laws, and so forth. And what he said was a country that doesn't have social insurance of some kind, because there are too many working class people who are one paycheck away from destitution and ruin. If you don't have some kind of social insurance, you risk social revolution. Right? So we have sort of a modern aim in mind. So he's also seeing that the rise of the flourishing of industrial capitalism, while he said it has lots of blessings, has all these problems. Also difficult to manage. But I think what I'll do, because I don't want to take us past 8 o'clock, is I think I'll stop here for today, and we'll take up and do more of the story next week, especially since I forgot one of the things I wanted to bring with me. We'll talk about his views on mass effects in modern life is one classic essay and a few other things. Let me stop there, and if I haven't sort of said too much and overwhelmed you, we can chit-chat for a while. Or